when Dr. Samuel Harrison's cabin was discovered 30 years after he vanished. Investigators found medical equipment worth millions, detailed maps of underground cave systems, and thousands of preserved plant specimens. But it was the final entry in his journal that revealed why a successful small-town doctor had become one of the most important medical researchers of the 20th century. Dr. Samuel Harrison had been the cornerstone of Cedar Falls, Montana, for 20 years. A man whose gentle hands had delivered over 400 babies, whose calm voice had guided families through their darkest hours, and whose tireless dedication had made him not just the town's physician, but its moral compass. Children would smile and wave when they saw his black medical bag walking down Main Street. Elderly patients would invite him to stay for dinner after house calls, treating him like a beloved son. The local church had a pew permanently reserved for him in the front row, though Samuel rarely had time to attend services due to medical emergencies that seemed to find him at all hours of the day and night. Samuel had arrived in Cedar Falls fresh out of medical school in 1935, a young idealist with dreams of serving rural communities that couldn't attract experienced physicians. The town of 2,800 people had been without a doctor for 3 years, relying on traveling medicine men and folk remedies that sometimes did more harm than good. When Samuel opened his practice in a modest building on Elm Street, word spread quickly through the mountain valleys that Cedar Falls finally had a real doctor again. What made Samuel special wasn't just his medical expertise, though that was considerable. He had graduated second in his class from Johns Hopkins, had trained under some of the most respected physicians on the East Coast, and could have easily secured a lucrative position in any major city. Instead, he chose to serve a community where many patients paid him with livestock, vegetables from their gardens, or handmade furniture instead of cash. Samuel never turned anyone away, regardless of their ability to pay, and he often traveled for hours on horseback to reach patients in remote cabins scattered throughout the mountainous region. The people of Cedar Falls had watched Samuel grow from an eager young doctor into a wise and experienced healer. He'd married Louise Weber, the schoolteacher, in 1938, and together they become the unofficial first family of the small mountain community. Louise helped in the medical practice, organizing patient records and assisting with procedures when the nearest hospital was a day's journey away. They'd tried to have children of their own, but after 3 heartbreaking miscarriages, they'd channeled their parental instincts into caring for the entire town. By 1955, Dr. Samuel Harrison was 42 years old and at the peak of his medical career. He'd successfully treated everything from complicated births to mining accidents, had saved countless lives during a devastating influenza outbreak in 1947, and had earned the respect and admiration of everyone within a 100-mile radius. State medical authorities often consulted him on difficult cases, and younger doctors would travel to Cedar Falls to learn his techniques for practicing medicine in isolated, resource-limited environments. But beneath Samuel's calm and competent exterior, something had been troubling him for months. It had started small, almost imperceptibly, with patterns he noticed during routine examinations. Symptoms that didn't quite fit established medical knowledge. Blood test results that showed anomalies he couldn't explain. Most concerning of all, a cluster of neurological symptoms appearing in patients who had no family history of such conditions and no obvious environmental causes. Samuel was a meticulous record keeper, a habit he developed during his medical training when professors emphasized the importance of documenting every detail for future reference. Over the course of 1954 and early 1955, his patient files had grown thick with notes about unexplained symptoms, strange test results, and treatment failures that made no medical sense. At first, he'd attributed these anomalies to his own inexperience or the limitations of rural medical practice. But as the patterns became more pronounced and more patients presented with similar mysterious symptoms, Samuel began to suspect something far more sinister. The breakthrough came in November 1955 when Samuel received laboratory results from the State Medical Facility in Helena. Blood samples from 12 Cedar Falls residents, taken over a period of 6 months, all showed the same unusual cellular abnormalities. The lab technician had noted that the samples appeared to contain traces of an unknown compound, something that didn't match any known medical or industrial substance. When Samuel cross-referenced these results with his patient files, a terrifying picture began to emerge. Every patient who showed the abnormal blood chemistry lived in the same geographic area, the eastern side of Cedar Falls, downhill from an abandoned mining operation that had closed in 1923. The mine had extracted copper and other minerals for nearly 30 years before shutting down when they were played out. But Samuel's research into historical records revealed that the mining company had also conducted experimental extraction of rare earth elements during its final years of operation, using chemical processes that were poorly understood at the time. Samuel spent weeks researching historical documents, contacting former miners who were still alive, and corresponding with geological experts at the University of Montana. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The mining company had dumped tons of chemical waste into underground caverns, waste that contained compounds that wouldn't be recognized as toxic until decades later. Groundwater flowing through these contaminated caverns was slowly carrying the toxic materials downhill, directly toward the water sources that supplied the eastern part of Cedar Falls. The symptoms Samuel had been documenting weren't random medical anomalies. They were the early stages of heavy metal poisoning, complicated by exposure to industrial compounds that medical science was only beginning to understand. Worse yet, based on his calculations of groundwater flow rates and contamination levels, the situation was going to get much worse before it got better. Within 5 to 10 years, unless something was done to stop the contamination, dozens of Cedar Falls residents would develop serious illnesses. Some would die. Samuel faced the most difficult decision of his medical career. If he reported his findings to state health authorities, Cedar Falls would likely be evacuated. The town's economy, based largely on logging and small-scale farming, would be destroyed. Property values would plummet to nothing. Families who had lived in the area for generations would lose everything they'd worked for. The community that had become his home, the people who trusted him with their lives, would be scattered to the winds. But if he said nothing, if he allowed people to continue living in contaminated areas and drinking polluted water, he would be violating his most sacred oath as a physician. He would be knowingly allowing preventable suffering and death, watching helplessly as the people he cared about slowly succumbed to diseases he could have warned them about. Samuel spent sleepless nights agonizing over his options. He considered trying to gradually relocate the most vulnerable families by recommending they move for fictional medical reasons. He explored the possibility of secretly funding water filtration systems that might reduce the contamination. He even investigated whether the old mining company might still have resources that could be used to fund cleanup efforts. But every scenario he considered either involved deceiving the people who trusted him or exposing them to risks they couldn't afford to take. The solution that eventually occurred to Samuel was as brilliant as it was heartbreaking. If he couldn't safely expose the contamination without destroying the community, and he couldn't ethically remain silent about it, then he would dedicate his life to finding a way to treat the effects of the poisoning. He would disappear from Cedar Falls, allowing people to believe he'd suffered a breakdown or died in an accident, and he would spend whatever years he had left developing medical treatments that could save his former patients when the contamination finally became undeniable. On December 15, 1955, Dr. Samuel Harrison walked out of his medical office for the last time. He left no note, no explanation, no indication of where he was going or why. To the people of Cedar Falls, their beloved doctor had simply vanished without a trace. Search parties combed the mountains for weeks, assuming he'd become lost or injured during a house call. Louise Harrison was devastated, unable to understand how the man she'd loved for 17 years could abandon her and their life together without a word. What nobody knew was that Samuel had spent months secretly preparing for his disappearance. Using money he'd saved over 20 years of medical practice, he'd purchased remote property deep in the Montana wilderness, 30 miles from the nearest road. He'd stockpiled medical equipment, research materials, and enough supplies to sustain himself for years of isolation. Most importantly, he'd established contact with underground networks of researchers who were studying environmental contamination and its health effects, scientists who were working outside the official medical establishment because their findings were too controversial or economically disruptive to be accepted by mainstream institutions. Samuel's plan was audacious in its scope and tragic in its personal cost. He would establish a secret research facility in the wilderness, using his medical expertise and the resources he'd accumulated to develop treatments for heavy metal poisoning and chemical contamination. He would study the progression of symptoms in contaminated populations by monitoring Cedar Falls from a distance, tracking health statistics and mortality rates to understand how the contamination affected different age groups and genetic backgrounds. And when he developed effective treatments, he would find a way to make them available to medical practitioners without revealing the source of his research. The location Samuel chose for his secret laboratory was a natural cave system in the remote Bitterroot Mountains, a site he discovered during hunting trips in his younger years. The caves were accessible only through treacherous mountain trails, hidden from aerial view by dense forest canopy, and supplied with fresh water from underground springs that showed no signs of contamination. Using his medical knowledge and considerable ingenuity, Samuel spent the winter of 1955 to 1956 converting the main cave into a fully functional research facility. The physical challenges of establishing his hidden laboratory were enormous. Samuel had to transport heavy medical equipment over mountain trails using pack animals, a process that took months and required multiple trips through dangerous terrain. He hand-carved storage areas into the cave walls, installed a primitive but effective ventilation system, and rigged solar panels and wind generators to provide electrical power for his equipment. By the spring of 1956, Dr. Samuel Harrison had disappeared so completely from civilized society that he might as well have been living on another planet. The loneliness was crushing. Samuel had been an intensely social man, energized by his interactions with patients and colleagues, sustained by his marriage to Louise and his sense of belonging to the Cedar Falls community. In his cave laboratory, he spoke to no one for months at a time, marking the passage of days by scratching lines on the cave wall and talking to himself just to hear the sound of human speech. The only visitors to his remote location were the wildlife that had learned to associate his presence with the food scraps he left outside the cave entrance. But Samuel's isolation served a purpose that sustained him through the darkest periods of loneliness and despair. Working 18-hour days by the light of kerosene lamps and primitive electrical systems, he made remarkable progress in understanding the effects of environmental contamination on human health. He developed new techniques for extracting toxic metals from living tissue, created medicines from plants he found in the surrounding forest, and conducted experiments that advanced medical knowledge by decades. Samuel's research was aided by his extensive correspondence with other scientists who were studying similar problems in different parts of the world. Using a complex system of mail drops and coded communications, he shared his findings with researchers in universities and government agencies, always careful to hide his identity and location. His discoveries, published anonymously in medical journals, contributed to breakthroughs in environmental medicine that saved thousands of lives over the following decades. As the years passed, Samuel aged rapidly under the stress of his isolated lifestyle and the weight of his secret knowledge. His hair turned white, His face became deeply lined from squinting in poor light, and his hands developed arthritis from the precise work of preparing medicines and documenting research results. But his mind remained sharp, focused on the mission that had driven him into exile and sustained him through nearly 3 decades of solitude. Samuel's predictions about the contamination in Cedar Falls proved devastatingly accurate. Beginning in the early 1960s, residents of the eastern part of town began developing the mysterious illnesses he documented in 1955. Cancer rates increased dramatically. Neurological disorders appeared in families with no history of such conditions. Birth defects became common among children born to parents who lived near the old mining site. By 1970, state health authorities finally acknowledged that an environmental health crisis existed in Cedar Falls, though they never identified the true source or extent of the contamination. From his hidden laboratory in the mountains, Samuel watched the unfolding tragedy with a mixture of vindication and heartbreak. His research had been correct, his warnings justified, but the people he'd tried to protect were suffering exactly as he'd predicted. Using the anonymous networks he'd established, Samuel began making his medical treatments available to physicians in the area, disguising his discoveries as breakthrough research from fictional laboratories and universities. Many of the people he'd once treated as patients were saved by medicines he'd developed in his cave, though they never knew their former doctor was still watching over them from the wilderness. The personal cost of Samuel's mission grew heavier with each passing year. He learned through newspaper obituaries and overheard conversations in distant towns that Louise had died in 1968, never knowing what had happened to her husband or why he'd abandoned her. Friends and colleagues from his medical practice had aged and died, taking with them any memory of the brilliant young doctor who'd served Cedar Falls with such dedication. The town itself had changed dramatically, its population scattered by the health crisis and economic disruption that Samuel's disappearance had helped to precipitate. By the 1980s, Samuel was in his 70s and beginning to show signs of the isolation and hardship that had defined his adult life. His research had evolved far beyond the original contamination problem in Cedar Falls, expanding to encompass groundbreaking work in environmental medicine, plant-based pharmaceuticals, and the treatment of industrial diseases. His hidden laboratory had become a repository of medical knowledge that was decades ahead of mainstream scientific understanding, a treasure trove of discoveries that could revolutionize healthcare if they could ever be safely revealed to the world. Samuel's final years were spent preparing for the eventual discovery of his work. He organized his research notes with meticulous care, created detailed maps and instructions that would allow future researchers to understand and continue his projects, and wrote extensive explanations of his methods and motivations. His journal entries from this period reveal a man who had found peace with his choices, despite the enormous personal sacrifices they had required. The entry that would later shock investigators and medical experts around the world was written just days before Samuel's death in 1985. March 10th, 1985. I am 72 years old today, and I believe my time in this cave is coming to an end. My body is failing. My hands shake too much to continue the precise work that has sustained me for 30 years, and I can feel the mountains calling me home in a way that suggests my mission here is complete. I've spent half my life in exile, developing treatments for diseases that mainstream medicine is only beginning to understand. The contamination that drove me from Cedar Falls was just the beginning. Through my research, I've discovered that industrial contamination is poisoning communities all over the world, creating health crises that won't be recognized for decades. The medicines I've developed could save millions of lives, but only if they can be properly tested and distributed through legitimate medical channels. I've arranged for my research to be discovered by people who can continue this work. The maps I've drawn will lead investigators to cache sites throughout the Western Mountains, where I've stored samples of every medicine I've developed. along with detailed instructions for their production and use. My hope is that future researchers will build upon my work, that the years I've spent in isolation will ultimately serve the greater good of humanity. I never married again after Louise. I never had children. I never owned a house or built a normal life for myself. But I've saved thousands of lives through medicines that bear no trace of my name or identity. I've advanced medical science by decades through research that will be attributed to others. And I've kept my oath as a physician, even when keeping that oath required me to abandon everything else I valued. The boy who dreamed of serving rural communities became a man who served all of humanity from the shadows. I regret the pain my disappearance caused to people who loved me, but I don't regret the choice itself. Sometimes the greatest service requires the greatest sacrifice, and sometimes the most important work is done by people whose names will never be remembered. If you're reading this, then my work has been found and my story is finally being told. Use what I've discovered. Build upon what I've created. And remember that the practice of medicine sometimes requires us to heal not just individual patients, but the world itself. Dr. Samuel Harrison died peacefully in his sleep on March 15, 1985, 30 years to the day after he disappeared from Cedar Falls. His body was discovered 6 months later by a geological survey team that was following his carefully drawn maps to investigate unusual cave formations in the Bitterroot Mountains. What they found revolutionized environmental medicine and earned Samuel posthumous recognition as one of the most important medical researchers of the 20th century. The hidden laboratory contained over 3,000 plant specimens, detailed analyses of water and soil contamination from dozens of industrial sites, and prototypes for medical treatments that wouldn't be developed by mainstream science for another 20 years. Samuel's maps led investigators to 17 cache sites throughout the western United States, each containing medicines and research materials that filled critical gaps in medical knowledge about environmental health. The impact of Samuel's work extended far beyond the contamination crisis that had originally driven him into exile. His research on plant-based medicines led to breakthrough treatments for cancer and neurological disorders. His methods for detecting and treating heavy metal poisoning became standard practice in environmental medicine. His techniques for growing medicinal plants in controlled environments revolutionized pharmaceutical research and made life-saving medicines available to communities around the world. Perhaps most importantly, Samuel's story inspired a new generation of medical researchers to consider the broader environmental and social context of human health. Medical schools began teaching courses on environmental medicine. Pharmaceutical companies invested in research on plant-based treatments. Government agencies developed new protocols for identifying and addressing industrial contamination before it could cause widespread health problems. The contamination in Cedar Falls was finally cleaned up in 1987, using techniques that Samuel had developed in his cave laboratory 20 years earlier. The town's population, which had dwindled to fewer than 800 residents during the health crisis of the 1960s and 1970s, began to recover as families returned to homes that were finally safe to occupy. A memorial statue in the town square honors Dr. Samuel Harrison as the physician who sacrificed his own life to save his community, though few people understand the full extent of that sacrifice. Louise Harrison's grave in the Cedar Falls Cemetery bears a simple inscription: "Beloved wife of Dr. Samuel Harrison, who gave his life in service to others." Next to her headstone is a memorial marker for Samuel, whose body was buried in the mountains where he'd spent his final years. The inscription reads, Dr. Samuel Harrison, 1913 to 1985. He healed the world from the shadows. The cave laboratory, where Samuel spent 30 years of his life, has been preserved as a monument to scientific dedication and medical ethics. Researchers from around the world make pilgrimages to the remote site, following the same treacherous mountain trails that Samuel once traveled alone with his pack animals. The facility has been expanded and modernized, but the original cave chamber remains exactly as Samuel left it, a testament to what one person can accomplish when driven by an unshakable commitment to healing and justice. Medical students study Samuel's journals as examples of how physicians must sometimes make impossible choices between competing ethical obligations. His decision to abandon his practice and disappear into the wilderness is debated in medical ethics courses, with some arguing that he violated his duty to his existing patients, while others maintain that he fulfilled a higher obligation to serve humanity as a whole. But perhaps the most important lesson of Dr. Samuel Harrison's story is that heroism doesn't always look the way we expect it to look. Heroes don't always stay to fight the battles we can see. Sometimes they disappear into the wilderness to fight battles that won't be understood for decades. Sometimes they sacrifice their own happiness, their own recognition, their own lives to serve causes that are bigger than themselves. The doctor who walked away from everything he loved didn't abandon his calling as a healer. He answered a higher calling, one that required him to heal not just individual patients, but the poisoned relationship between human civilization and the natural world. His 30 years of exile weren't an escape from responsibility. They were the ultimate expression of responsibility, carried out with a dedication that few people could sustain and a vision that spanned generations. Dr. Samuel Harrison saved thousands of lives through medicines he developed in secret. He advanced medical science by decades through research he conducted in isolation. He protected communities around the world from environmental hazards they didn't even know existed. And he did it all from a cave in the Montana wilderness, speaking to no one, seeking no recognition, asking for nothing except the knowledge that his sacrifice was serving a purpose greater than himself. If you're enjoying these incredible, true stories of hidden heroes and secret sacrifices, hit that subscribe button because we've got many more tales of courage and dedication waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen to hear another story about someone who gave up everything they loved to serve something they believed in even more, proving that the greatest acts of heroism often happen in silence, in secret, and in service to truths that the world isn't ready to understand.